Imagine holding a stranger's baby to your breast at 2 in the morning, its cheeks pink and full, while 3 miles away, in a cold room above a laundry, your own baby is crying itself hoarse in someone else's arms, because your milk, the milk your body made for your own child, has just been sold. This was not rare. In Victorian England, it was a business, a well-run, carefully inspected, quietly ruthless business, with price lists and physical examinations and contracts written in careful copperplate. And at the center of it, night after night, was a woman nobody thought to ask how she felt about any of it. Hi friends. Tonight, we're going somewhere gentle, but somewhere true. Into the hushed nurseries of Victorian houses, and into the small, cold rooms where the women who fed those nurseries kept their own secrets. So if you'd like, dim the lights now, pull the blanket up over your shoulder, let your own breathing slow down to match mine. Tonight's story moves slowly, the way milk warms slowly, the way a house settles into sleep one creaking floorboard at a time. Let's begin. Picture a terraced house in London in the 1850s. Narrow, tall, respectable. 4 floors, a black iron railing out front, a brass knocker polished every Tuesday. Inside, on the 2nd floor, there is a nursery, wallpaper with soft green ivy, a rocking chair by the window, a crib with a canopy of white muslin, so fine it moves when someone simply walks past it. And in the rocking chair at 3 in the morning sits a woman named, let's say, Martha. She is 26. Her hands are chapped from lye soap. Her feet, tucked under the hem of her plain grey dress, are cold against the floorboards because the fire in this room is kept low at night, just enough to take the chill off, never enough to waste coal on a servant's comfort. The baby in her arms is not hers. The baby in her arms belongs to the house. His name is Master Edwin, and he is 9 days old, and he is, by every account, a healthy and hungry little creature. He roots at Martha's breast in the dark with the single-minded urgency that all babies have, that particular blind trust that says, somewhere milk exists, and it is close. You can hear the house around them. A clock somewhere down the hall, ticking with the patient stubbornness clocks have. The wind outside, testing the window frame, finding it solid. Somewhere below in the kitchen, a kettle that was left too near the banked fire lets out one small tired sigh of steam. Martha feeds Edwin, and Edwin feeds. And 3 miles away, in a rented room above a laundry that smells permanently of lye and wet linen, Martha's own daughter, 6 weeks old, a little smaller than Edwin, a little more restless, is being walked back and forth by Martha's sister, who has agreed to keep her for 4 shillings a week, and who is doing her best with a bottle of watered cow's milk and a great deal of patience. Martha will not see her daughter for another 11 days. This is the arrangement. This is, in fact, rather a good arrangement as these things went. You might wonder how a woman ends up in a rocking chair feeding one baby, while her own goes hungry 3 miles off. The answer is simply arithmetic, done in a hard century, a wet nurse living in, meaning she moved into the family's house entirely, ate the family's food, slept under the family's roof, could earn between 12 and 40 pounds a year, depending on the household's wealth and her own perceived quality. For comparison, a general housemaid earned perhaps 10 to 12 pounds a year for entirely different and considerably less intimate labor. 12 to 40 pounds sounds like very little to us now. To Martha, whose husband had died of a fever the previous winter, and who had a rent payment due every single Monday, whether or not the world had been kind to her that week, it was the difference between a roof and no roof. It was, quite literally, survival, purchased with the one resource her body still had to sell, now that her husband's wages were gone. There is something almost unbearably practical about it when you sit with it slowly like this. Milk was a commodity. Grief did not pause the ledger. Now, here is where the story turns oddly formal, almost bureaucratic, in a way you might not expect from something so intimate. Households did not simply hire the first available woman. There were agencies for this. Wet nurse registries, run out of respectable-looking offices, where women seeking this work would present themselves to be assessed. Not so different, in its cold procedural rhythm, from applying for any other post, except that the interview process included things no other job application did. A prospective wet nurse might be asked to produce a certificate from a physician, confirming her milk was good, which, in the medical thinking of the day, meant judged by color, thickness, even taste, and by the general health, temperament, and moral character of the woman herself. There was a widespread belief, entirely unsupported by anything we'd now call science, that a nurse's personality passed into the child through her milk. A nervous woman might make a nervous baby. A woman prone to melancholy might pass her sadness along like a flavor. You can imagine the small, dry absurdity of this if you allow yourself a quiet smile in the dark right now. Physicians solemnly discussing the temperament of milk, as though it were wine, as though a woman's grief over her own hungry child 3 miles away might somehow curdle into the milk she gave to somebody else's son. And yet nobody in the room ever seemed to consider that the sorrow itself might be worth asking about directly. Physical requirements were exacting too. Agencies and the families who used them often preferred nurses whose own babies were close in age to the child needing feeding. The milk was thought to be better suited that way, which meant, with a kind of quiet cruelty dressed up as science, that a woman's own recent motherhood was precisely the qualification that made her useful to somebody else's household, and precisely the thing she'd then have to set aside, for months at a time, to do the job. Some households required the wet nurse's own child to be sent away entirely before she could take up residence, sometimes to relatives, as with Martha and her sister, sometimes, more grimly, to what were called baby farms. We'll sit with baby farms properly a little further on tonight, because there is a particular figure connected to them, a farmer, as they were called, who has a story that will make your skin go cold, softly, the way a draft finds you even in a warm bed. But not yet. For now, let's stay here, in Martha's rocking chair, in the low firelight, with Edwin's small, hungry mouth finding its rhythm. The mistress of the house, Edwin's actual mother, is asleep down the hall. This, too, was simply how it worked in wealthier homes. The lady of the house was not expected to nurse her own child. It was considered, in many circles, faintly improper for a woman of means to do so, thought to be hard on her figure, her nerves, her place in society's evening calendar. There were dinners to attend, correspondence to keep up, a husband's household to run. A baby needing to be fed every 2 or 3 hours around the clock was frankly incompatible with any of that. So the arrangement solved 2 problems with one woman's body. It freed the lady of the house from a demanding, unglamorous labor, and it gave a poor widow like Martha a wage she could not otherwise have earned. Whether it solved anything for the baby 3 miles away, in the room above the laundry, was a question nobody in the ivy-wallpapered nursery was in the habit of asking. There's a particular sound that recurs in accounts from women who did this work. The sound of a house at night, once the family had gone to bed, and only the nurse and the infant were awake. Floorboards settling, the scrape of a coal shovel, banked low. Somewhere outside, a night watchman's slow footsteps on cobblestone, calling the hour in a voice, pitched just soft enough not to wake the street, just loud enough to be heard by anyone lying awake, wondering what time it was. Martha, in these hours, sometimes hummed. Not a lullaby exactly, more of a low, wordless sound, the kind you make without deciding to, the kind that comes from a body doing tired, repetitive, necessary work. Edwin's small hand in these moments would sometimes find a fold of her sleeve and hold on, the way infants do, gripping instinctively at whatever is nearest and warm. It is worth noticing, gently, without judgment, the way you might notice rains starting outside a window, that infants are not particular about whose warmth they're gripping. They simply grip. It is only the grown women involved who carried the particular weight of knowing whose child was whose. Martha's contract, like most, ran roughly a year, the typical span for which a household needed a wet nurse, until the child was old enough to be weaned onto pap, a soft mixture of bread and milk, and eventually solid food. A year is a long stretch of a young woman's life. To spend feeding a stranger's child on a fixed schedule, dictated by somebody else's household, while her own child grows up mostly in someone else's arms, reaching milestones, a first tooth, a first unsteady step, that she will hear about second-hand, in a letter or not at all. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles into a story like this. Not tragic exactly, not scandalous, just heavy in the way. Damp wool is heavy, in the way a long day is heavy. Martha did not consider herself a victim of anything in particular. She would very likely have described her position as fortunate, all things considered, compared to the alternative, the workhouse, the streets, watching her daughter go hungry with no wage at all coming in. This is perhaps the strangest and most Victorian detail of all, that an arrangement built on real sorrow was, at the very same time, honestly regarded, by the woman living inside it, as a mercy. Down the hall, the mistress of the house slept undisturbed through the whole of it, night after night, secure in the knowledge that her son was fed, and that the woman feeding him was, by all the paperwork, entirely satisfactory. Good milk, good character, good references, still tired, still faithful, still hers to give. Night after night, one body feeding 2 households worth of need. But there was one part of this arrangement that even the other servants in a grand household spoke of only in careful whispers, down in the kitchen after the family had gone up to bed. Something about where the wet nurses themselves had come from, before they ever reached a nursery like this one, and what became of the children they'd been forced to leave behind in order to arrive there. There was a woman named Amelia Dyer, and if you have never heard her name before, let it arrive gently now, the way a cold draught arrives under a door, not with a slam, just a quiet seeping in that makes you pull the blanket a little closer. Amelia was, on paper, a nurse, a respectable-sounding word. In practice, she was one of the most notorious of what the era called baby farmers. Women who, for a fee, took in the infants that wet nurses and other struggling mothers could not keep with them while they worked. Some baby farmers were simply poor women doing an honest, difficult job of caring for other people's children on a shoestring. Many were exactly that, and did it with real tenderness, in cramped rooms, on very little money, asking nothing more than to be believed when they said they were doing their best. But some were not that at all, and it is one of the quieter horrors of this whole arrangement that a mother handing her infant over to a baby farmer in 1880 had almost no way of knowing, from the outside, which kind of woman she was leaving her child with. Hi again, friends. If you've just settled back in, we left off last time with Martha in her rocking chair, and a thread left dangling about where women like her had come from, and what became of the children they left behind. Let's follow that thread now, slowly, the way you'd follow a single loose strand of wool without pulling too hard. Picture, if you will, an advertisement in a local paper. Small print tucked between notices for lodgings and second-hand furniture. Respectable married woman wishes to adopt a child. Every care and comfort. Small premium required. Premium here meant payment, a one-time fee. Sometimes 10 or 12 pounds, sometimes considerably less, handed over by a desperate mother, in exchange for the promise that her baby would be looked after. For a woman like Martha's sister, minding an infant honestly for 4 shillings a week, this was simply how the system was meant to function. A fair, small, difficult exchange. Milk for money, care for coin. It kept a roof over 2 households instead of none. But for a baby farmer with no intention of caring for the children at all, that one-time premium was the entire point. Once paid, there was no further obligation, no weekly fee to keep collecting, no ongoing relationship to maintain, no need for the child to survive very long at all. And so, in the very worst of these arrangements, infants simply stopped being accounted for. They vanished from records the way steam vanishes from a cold window, slowly, and then all at once, and nobody thought to ask which house they'd gone into last. You can hear, if you let yourself, how quiet a street could be around a house like that. No crying from the windows for very long, no pram out for an afternoon walk. Just an ordinary brick house, net curtains drawn, a woman coming and going with parcels, and neighbors who assumed, reasonably enough, that whatever happened behind a stranger's door was that stranger's business. We won't dwell on Amelia Dyer's particular crimes tonight. This is not the hour for anything sharp or frightening, and her story, when the courts finally caught up with her in 1896, was grim enough that it doesn't belong in a room where you're trying to fall asleep. What matters for our purposes is simply this, that she was eventually caught, that dozens of infants were traced back to her care and never found alive, and that her arrest became one of the moments that finally forced the country to ask an uncomfortable question out loud. How many mothers, driven by poverty and shame and the simple economics we talked about last time, had handed their children to strangers with no way of checking what became of them? Let that settle for a moment, softly, like ash falling from a fire that's burned low. Not every baby farmer was a monster. Most were simply poor women trying to survive the same grinding arithmetic as the mothers who paid them. But the system had almost no way of telling the two kinds apart until it was too late, and it was built, quietly, on the assumption that nobody with money needed to look too closely at what happened to children born to women without any. Now, let's step back from that cold house with its drawn curtains and return to somewhere warmer, because Martha's story and the stories of women like her were not always this bleak. Many wet nurses' own children did survive, did thrive, raised by grandmothers, aunts, older sisters, or reasonably kind neighbors paid honestly for their trouble. Martha's daughter, in fact, grew up perfectly well under her aunt's care, and was reunited with her mother within the year, the way most such arrangements actually resolved. It is important, in a story like this, not to let the very worst examples stand in for the whole truth. Most of this was simply hard, not monstrous, grinding, not Gothic, but even in the ordinary, non-monstrous version of this arrangement, even in Martha's own case, there is something worth sitting with quietly. A woman's body in this era was treated as a kind of shared resource, movable between households according to whoever could pay for it. Her milk went where the money was. Her presence went where the household needed her. Her own child went wherever was cheapest and safest to arrange, and she visited on whatever schedule her employer permitted. Sometimes an afternoon a fortnight, sometimes less. You might wonder what the wet nurses themselves felt about all this, in their own words, and here the historical record grows frustratingly thin, the way old ink fades on a page left too long near a window. Few of these women were literate enough to leave letters or diaries. Fewer still had any reason to think their private griefs were worth writing down for anyone else to read. What we know mostly comes from the other direction, from employers' letters, from agency records, from the occasional newspaper report. When something went wrong enough to become news, there is one exception worth pausing on. A handful of memoirs from Victorian nursemaids and nurses, written later in life, sometimes in old age, do survive, dictated to a grandchild, or written out slowly in a plain, careful hand for a local historical society decades after the fact. In them, you find small human details that never make it into the agency paperwork. One woman recalled, gently, that she used to sing to the household's baby the very same lullaby her own mother had sung to her, and that doing so made her feel, in her words, less far from home, though I was not near it at all. Another recalled counting the weeks on her fingers each night before sleep. The way you might count sheep, except what she was counting toward, was the day she'd see her own child again. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that image. A grown woman, alone in the dark, doing arithmetic with her own fingers instead of falling asleep, counting toward a reunion instead of counting away from wakefulness. If you're finding your own eyes growing heavy right now, let them. There is nothing more you need to do with this image, except let it rest in you gently, the way it must have rested heavily in her. Households, for their part, developed their own small rituals around all this. Rituals that reveal, almost accidentally, how aware everyone quietly was of the strange emotional arrangement they'd built. Some families gave their wet nurse a black silk ribbon to wear, a small mark of her elevated status among the household servants. She outranked the housemaids, was fed better than the cook, sometimes even had her own small sitting room, separate from the general servants' quarters. This was not generosity so much as insurance. A contented, well-fed, unstressed nurse was thought to produce better milk. Her comfort was managed the way you'd manage a good milking cow's comfort. Attentively, but for the sake of the product, not entirely for her own sake. And there is something almost darkly funny, in a very quiet, dry way, about that black silk ribbon. A small mark of status handed to a woman precisely because her body had become, however briefly, the most valuable machinery in the house. She could outrank the housemaids and still not know, some weeks, whether her own daughter had cut her first tooth. Evenings in these households often followed a set rhythm. You could set a clock by, if clocks paid attention to sorrow. The family dined at 8, the nursery quieted by 9. The nurse fed the child at 10, again near 1 in the morning, again toward dawn. The household's whole night bent gently around an infant's small, insistent hunger, while the woman making that hunger bearable lay awake doing her own private arithmetic in the dark, still counting, still waiting, still hoping, the same 3 words, turned over and over in 100 different dark rooms across the city. But not every household ran their nursery so quietly or so gently. In some homes, the arrangement between a lady of the house and the woman feeding her child grew far stranger and far more intimate than either of them had likely expected, closer, in some cases, to a kind of complicated shadow marriage, with jealousies, favors, and quiet grudges that servants downstairs gossiped about for years after the fact. Imagine a lady of the house standing in the nursery doorway at midnight, not to check on her own child, but to watch, in silence, the woman who was feeding him, and feeling, quite against her own wishes, a flicker of something close to jealousy toward a servant. This happened more often than you might expect. Hi again, friends. Last time we left off with a hint that some of these nursery arrangements grew far more tangled than simple employer and employee. And here is where that tangle begins to show itself. You have to understand what a wet nurse actually became inside a household over the course of a year. She fed the child every few hours. She was, in the most literal bodily sense, the source of comfort, warmth, and survival for that infant, far more constantly present than the mother, who might visit the nursery for 20 minutes after breakfast, and again before dinner, dressed for company, perfumed, careful not to disturb too much. The wet nurse smelled of milk and wood smoke, and the particular warm smell that settles into anyone who spends all day and night with an infant against their chest. The baby knew that smell. The baby turned toward it, rooted for it, calmed at the sound of that particular woman's heartbeat before any other. It is not hard to imagine, then, how some mothers found this quietly unbearable. Not because anyone had wronged them. Nobody had. It was simply the arrangement they themselves had chosen, for reasons that made perfect social and practical sense. And yet there is a particular kind of ache in watching your own child settle, calm and trusting, into someone else's arms faster than into yours. A few household diaries and letters from the period hint at exactly this. Mistresses who found small reasons to dismiss a wet nurse early, reasons that, read closely, a century and a half later, look less like genuine complaints about milk quality, and more like the ordinary human sting of feeling replaced in your own nursery. There is a soft, dry irony sitting quietly inside all this, if you let yourself notice it in the dark. An entire social system built, in large part, to spare wealthy women the physical burden of feeding their own children. And yet that same system quietly handed those women a new burden nobody had budgeted for, a private, unspoken grief at having handed the most tender part of motherhood to someone else. Meanwhile, downstairs, in the kitchen and the servants' hall, a wet nurse's elevated status bred its own particular friction. She earned more than the housemaids. She ate better food, often the same food as the family upstairs, since it was believed a well-fed nurse made better milk. She sometimes had her own room, when other servants shared attic space 3 or 4 to a bed. This bred exactly the kind of quiet resentment you'd expect among people working 12 and 14-hour days for a fraction of her wage. Resentment usually kept carefully out of earshot of the family, but very much alive in the whispered conversations over the washing-up basin. You can hear it, if you listen closely enough to the old accounts. The particular clatter of pots being scrubbed a little harder than necessary, a housemaid's sigh held just a beat too long, a cook's dry remark about her ladyship upstairs with her ribbon and her cream, delivered just loud enough for the scullery maid to hear, just soft enough that it could never be repeated to anyone who mattered. There was, too, a kind of tenderness that sometimes grew between a wet nurse and the child she fed, one that outlasted the contract itself. Some nurses stayed on afterward as regular nursemaids, unwilling or unable to leave a child they had, in every physical sense that mattered to an infant raised. Grown men and women, writing decades later about their Victorian childhoods, sometimes mention their wet nurse with more open warmth than they mention their own mother, a detail that says a great deal, quietly, about where an infant's earliest loyalty actually settles, regardless of whose name is on the family portrait. One such account, from a gentleman recalling his childhood in the 1860s, describes his nurse's hands more vividly, more lovingly, than he describes his own mother's face. He remembered the particular roughness of her palm, chapped from years of washing and carrying and holding, and the low humming sound she made, wordless, the same low hum Martha made in our very first story tonight, as though every tired woman doing this work, in every different house across the city, had quietly invented the same small comfort for herself, without ever comparing notes. It's a strange, quiet thought to sit with as your own eyes grow heavier, that somewhere in a city full of separate, private griefs, so many women were, without knowing it, doing exactly the same small human thing to get through the same long nights. By the time a child was weaned, usually somewhere between 9 months and a year, the wet nurse's role in the household came to its natural end. Sometimes this parting was handled with real warmth, a small gift, a good reference for future work, tears on both sides that surprised even the family giving them. Sometimes it was handled coldly, a final wage paid and a carriage called to take her back to whatever life waited for her outside the house, with barely a backward glance from the family whose child she had just spent a year keeping alive. And so Martha, whose story opened our evening tonight, eventually left the ivy wall-papered nursery much as she'd arrived, quietly, competently, carrying her small case of belongings down the same back stairs she'd climbed a year before. Edwin, by then, was toddling and talking and utterly uninterested in the woman who had fed him through every one of his first cold nights. Martha, for her part, went home to a daughter who had grown from an infant into a small, sturdy, curious child who did not, at first, entirely recognize her. It is a particular kind of quiet grief, that last detail, a mother meeting her own child's shy, uncertain gaze, the gaze of a stranger being polite to a grown-up she's told to call Mama, still leaving, still arriving, still starting over, the same small case, the same back stairs, 100 times a year, in 100 different houses across the city. There was, though, one more part of this whole arrangement that the century tried very hard not to speak of at all. Something about what happened to a wet nurse's own body and her own health once her year of service ended and no household needed her any more. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a woman's health once she has stopped being useful, and Victorian England was very good at that silence. Hi again, friends. We left off with a hint about what became of these women once their year of service ended, and the honest answer is that very little was written down, because very little was thought worth writing. A wet nurse's body, over the course of a year of round-the-clock feeding, poor sleep, and often a diet that, whatever its quality, could not fully replace what constant nursing demanded of her, was frequently left depleted in ways nobody at the time had proper language for. We would recognize some of it now as simple exhaustion, some as the ordinary toll of chronic sleep deprivation, some as the aftermath of birth itself, barely recovered from before the work began. At the time, a nurse who grew pale, thin, or slow was simply considered to be nearing the end of her usefulness, her milk failing, her contract quietly not renewed. There is something almost unbearably tidy about that phrase, her milk failing, as though the woman herself had not been asked to give anything at all, as though a body could simply run dry the way a well runs dry, with no separate accounting for what had been drawn from it, night after night, for months on end. And yet, for all of that, most of these women went on. They returned to their own children, or found other work, or, in time, grew old in modest rooms with grandchildren of their own, and the year they spent feeding a stranger's baby folded itself quietly into the larger, unremarkable shape of a hard life fully lived. Martha, our woman from the very first story tonight, lived to be 61. Her daughter grew up, married a carpenter, and had children of her own, one of whom, in extreme old age, was the one who finally wrote down the little that is known of Martha's year in that ivy wallpapered nursery. A few pages, in a granddaughter's careful hand, tucked into a family Bible for 100 years, before anyone thought to take them out again. It is worth sitting with that, gently, as we start to bring tonight's story home. So much of what we've spent this evening with, the rocking chairs, the black silk ribbons, the counted fingers in the dark, the quiet resentments below stairs, survives only by accident. A few pages in a Bible, a gentleman's fond memory of a servant's hands, a newspaper report about the very worst of it, filed away in an archive nobody visits anymore. Most of these women left no trace at all beyond the households whose children grew up healthy because of them, and that, perhaps, is the softest and truest thing to end on tonight. Somewhere in nearly every grand Victorian household you might picture, the ivy wallpaper, the black iron railings, the brass knocker polished every Tuesday, there was, quietly, upstairs, a woman whose body was doing the actual work of keeping a child alive, while her own child waited for her, somewhere else in the city, in a room with a lower fire and a thinner blanket. Let's go back, now, to where we began tonight, to that same house, that same low fire, that same rocking chair. Picture Martha there one final time. Not at the start of her year of service, but near its very end, Edwin heavy and sleepy against her shoulder, his small hand loosely curled in the fabric of her sleeve one last time. Outside, the same wind tests the same window frame. Somewhere down the hall, the same clock keeps its same patient rhythm. And soon, very soon, she will carry her small case down the back stairs, out into a city full of 1,000 other women doing exactly what she did, in 1,000 other quiet nurseries, all of them tired, all of them far from something, all of them in their own way holding on, still tired, still far from home, still, in the end, enough. If this story kept you company tonight, you're welcome to like or subscribe, but only if it felt worth it. There's no rush and no pressure. For now, let the fire burn low, let the wind settle outside your own window, and let yourself drift slowly, the way this whole city once drifted, one quiet nursery at a time, into sleep.